I'm not really a fan of the word toxic. It's vague, overused, and in the context of relationships, whether real or fictional, it's more of a warning label than an explanation. If we want to understand what's wrong in a relationship, we have to use better words. Words like cruel, dysfunctional, coercive. And those are the exact words that I'd use to describe the narrator from the Stanley parable. Because whatever this dynamic is between Stanley and the narrator, it isn't healthy. In fact, it's a performance, one of control, dependence, and manipulation. And we, the players, are all too eager to enable it. That's why today, we'll be looking at the relationship at the heart of the Stanley parable. What it is, why it's so bizarre, and what it says about control, our relationships, and maybe even ourselves. But fair warning, this video gets a little dark and talks a lot about abusive relationships, so please keep that in mind and know that there's a link in the description should you need help. Okay, you know what? That's enough for the intro. Let's just jump straight in.
This is the story of a man named Stanley.
I'm going to go ahead and assume that if you clicked on this video, you've played or watched a playthrough of the Stanley parable before, and if you haven't, then well, that would be surprising since its very first version is over a decade old, not even including the Half-Life mod. Anyway, the Stanley parable satirizes games and the industry as a whole, and therefore a lot of it isn't supposed to make sense as one whole narrative. For our purposes today though, this means that we can view the titular Stanley in one of three ways based on how we, the player, fit into each ending. Think of it like Venn diagrams. The first is we control Stanley, but we are not Stanley. This one implies that Stanley exists as his own person within the narrative of the game, and we just take control during certain sections. This is usually how games, especially story-based games, operate, and means that all the choices we make are the ones that Stanley wants to make. The second is the circles completely overlapping. In this scenario, there is no distinction between Stanley and the player. We are Stanley, full stop. The third has the circles completely separate. Sure, we control Stanley, but he has his own wants and desires. This is most apparent in the generic freedom ending where you actually go through the narrator's story as intended. By the end of it, you lose control of Stanley. All of these exist simultaneously and are used in different ways for satirical purposes. For this video, all three will have to be taken into consideration. Is it smart to take a satirical game this seriously in how it depicts the relationship between two of its characters? Probably not. But I've made it this far into this video and I'm too stubborn to stop. So let's dive into the relationship that manifests between these two. Starting with the aforementioned freedom ending. In it, while we no longer control Stanley, you know who's still there? Obviously, it's the narrator. Now, if the narrator was a neutral third party that was simply describing what was happening, then this wouldn't be a big deal. But as we all should know, he's not. He's his own character with his own goals and motivations, and is able to dictate what happens to Stanley sometimes more than we are. He's less of a narrator, if you think about it, and more of a storyteller. As you play through the game and get a variety of different endings, a peculiar dynamic begins between the narrator and Stanley. In a Tom and Jerry or Looney Tunes-esque fashion, it seems like they're always trying to foil the other's plans. While Stanley tries to go against the narrator in acts of defiance, the narrator does everything in his power to try and make you see his vision for his story. So why is the narrator doing this in the first place? Well, we're given multiple reasons throughout the game. Sometimes he just wants to have a good story or a good game, but in multiple endings like the apartment one, it's shown that the narrator apparently has a deep amount of care for Stanley. He feels sorry for him, wasting his life just pushing buttons, and wants him to see the light, to show him there's another way. This is reinforced by the fact that, in the epilogue, the narrator had been trying to make a button that says Jim finally say Stanley.
Jim, Stanley. Stanley. Jim.
It's a touching and sentimental moment when playing through the game normally, and for our purposes, it does show that the narrator does actually care for Stanley. He wanted him to find enjoyment in his story. However, the narrator is often cruel about how he goes about this care. With that very same apartment ending, including him actively mocking Stanley for believing that he had a wife, going as far as to imply that no one would actually care about Stanley like that. But this isn't the only time he does something cruel either. The insanity ending involves him describing Stanley going insane and eventually dying. Remember, the narrator actively has control of this story when he's around, and when he doesn't have control, he becomes incredulous. So this wasn't just him describing what happens, this was him deciding what happens. Now, you might think that this is sort of a flip-flop of behavior, is just another layer of satire, but sadly, this is a very real and all too common occurrence in our world. The narrator's behavior is reminiscent of something known as coercive control, as well as just general psychological abuse. Coercive control specifically is a form of abuse where the main goal is to degrade, isolate, and deprive a person of their rights to physical security, dignity, and respect. It puts the victim in a state of terror and entrapment, and includes tactics such as monitoring movements, social isolation, and restriction of access to financial resources, employment, education, or medical care. I think you see where this is going. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves here though, because Stanley, at least on the surface, doesn't appear to be all that innocent either. This is most apparent in the space ending, where the only way through is to bring Stanley to the top of a set of stairs and throw him off until he dies. This entire ending exists as a way for the narrator to find a compromise with Stanley, a way for them to both be happy instead of constantly being at each other's throats. Even while Stanley is dying, the narrator pleads with us not to, and he begins to become more and more desperate, realizing that you hate him and his game to the point of ending it all yourself. Now, we could also argue that this is the narrator being horrified yet again at losing control, but I'm not so sure that's the case here. Either way though, this ending goes to show a constant theme throughout the game. The narrator and Stanley cannot be happy at the same time. One always has to ruin it for the other. This is where that whole Tom and Jerry Looney Tunes-esque dynamic really comes into play. But the issue is we don't really know Stanley at all, and almost everything we do know about him comes from the narrator. This presents a major issue with their relationship and is part of the reason why it's so dysfunctional. The narrator only wants Stanley to be the version of himself that the narrator is okay with. At this point, you've probably noticed that I've only referred to this dynamic as a generic relationship. I hesitate to call this a friendship because it's so one-sided. Putting aside the satirical nature of the game for a moment, the controlling tendencies of the narrator and the power he has over Stanley makes this uncomfortable. And it makes Stanley's character seem to be one of rebellion. Keep that in mind because it'll be important later. This is why I would classify the narrator as, at best, a toxic friend. At worst, an abusive one. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for adults to be victimized in their friendships, and the type of psychological abuse that the narrator demonstrates is linked with personality traits like narcissism. Please note that I'm not referring to narcissistic personality disorder, as that is a separate thing. Narcissism as a trait is really just a sense of self-importance and exists in a spectrum. It's a personality trait. I'm not saying that he has a personality disorder. We can see that the narrator, at the very least, has this trait in spades though, as all throughout the game, he believes his story is the best of the best and even celebrates himself through reviews in the memory zone. This means that, sadly, Stanley is a victim, especially if we consider him as separate from the player to any degree. The thing is though, I do truly believe that the narrator wants to help Stanley, but his own ego gets in the way of him doing anything good. Instead, Stanley is trapped, and if we're viewing the events of the game as Stanley making all the choices, then of course he would rebel. He literally can't escape. But there is an ending that pokes a hole in this idea. During the museum ending, a female narrator speaks to you, the player, but refers to Stanley and the narrator as if they're their own people. Take a listen.
Oh, look at these two. How they wish to destroy one another. How they wish to control one another. How they both wish to be free. Can you see? Can you see how much they need one another? No. Perhaps not. Sometimes these things cannot be seen.
She comments on how they want to destroy each other, control each other, and be free. But they need each other and can't realize it. So, is Stanley less of a victim than I thought? Maybe. The narrator is just as trapped as Stanley is, and while Stanley has his personal hell of being forced into the narrator's story, the narrator has his personal hell of having someone break it over and over again. It's reminiscent of the cycle of abuse, where victims perpetrate abuse they receive to others. Stanley can still be a victim while perpetuating the cycle, and so can the narrator. But ultimately, we don't really get to know Stanley's true feelings on the matter, just the inferences made from the various endings that he wants to escape the narrator. There is, however, the skip button ending, where the narrator is slowly driven insane by being left alone. And then he starts to speak about how he wishes Stanley to feel all the torment that he has, in a concerningly genuine way. I think this ending represents the cycle really well, with Stanley being completely unable to escape the room, being forced to continue pushing the button, and the narrator being unable to escape the crippling loneliness and insanity that he's being driven towards. It's a tragedy for both sides, and the cycle just continues. But for Stanley, the only way out, a lot of the time, is death. Even the escape pod ending doesn't work for Stanley. He's completely trapped with the narrator, forced to relive his own personal hell. No way out. But there is someone, part of this story, that does get to escape from that very same escape pod. I think it's time for us to talk about the best part of the Stanley parable. The bucket. Okay, hear me out. The bucket serves as a pretty major aspect of the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, and its existence changes many of the endings you normally get. This bucket is powerful enough to change the narrative, and we can see that despite the occasional digs from the narrator, the bucket is actually very important to Stanley. But first, who is the bucket? Where is the bucket? Why is the bucket? Well, in the game, it's given by the narrator to Stanley for emotional reassurance, but mechanically it alters several of the usual endings, with two in particular being important. First, we have the apartment ending, which is completely different with the bucket, to the point that you're even in a different apartment. In this ending, we are brought through a quick back and forth of Stanley bringing the bucket to work and then back home, with the apartment getting steadily more sultry with each cycle. The narrator continues in the background though. At first he's supposedly speaking for the bucket, but once you pick up the phone that the bucket instructs you to, the narrator completely changes his tune. He begins talking about how he gave the bucket to Stanley because he thought he was lonely and needed a friend, and then goes on to be concerned for Stanley for thinking the bucket could speak to him. As the scene goes on though, even the narrator begins to like the bucket, and by the end of it begins frantically demanding that Stanley gives him the bucket. Now, putting aside the implication that Stanley was having a very intimate relationship with the bucket, it actually does appear that the bucket was speaking to him. As you've seen throughout the scene, words from the perspective of the bucket appear on screen, telling Stanley what to do. Even the narrator comments on how Stanley isn't listening to him anymore. And here we have another example of the narrator being unable to let Stanley be happy, as he forces his own ideas of what Stanley should and shouldn't be doing. It seems like the narrator is almost jealous of the attention that the bucket is getting, and that would be part of the reason he so fervently desires it by the end. Okay, hold on, I need a moment. I'm talking about a bucket from a satirical video game, and I'm doing so with an intense amount of seriousness. I just need a moment to process it. Okay, I'm good now. So the real question is, does Stanley actually like the bucket? Is Stanley truly happy with it? Well, I believe our next bucket ending has the answer. See, earlier when we discussed the escape pod ending, it didn't work for Stanley, but something changed with the bucket. Once you reach the pod, a cutscene begins, with Stanley placing the bucket in the pod, comforting it, and even wiping away its non-existent tears. And then he sets it free. And this time, the escape pod works. Not only does this show that Stanley likes the bucket, not only does it show he may have a deep sense of care for the bucket, but it is also proof that Stanley, and only Stanley, is actively trapped. The bucket can't escape, but he can't. An act of selfless love allows the bucket to be set free. How beautiful. So on some level, the bucket allows us to see some of Stanley's personality, or at least as much personality a character like him can have. The fact that Stanley sets the bucket free would imply that he himself doesn't want to be here, further adding to the idea that Stanley is actively trying to rebel against the narrator. But it also shows just how abusive the narrator is. He admits he gave the bucket to Stanley to help his loneliness, but then desperately tries to take it away when Stanley doesn't need him anymore. We're beginning to see a pattern. The narrator wants to help Stanley, but only on his terms. He wants to help Stanley so long as he is able to remain in control. And with that, I believe the bucket adds a new context to their dynamic. Rather than a cycle of abuse that I described before, it's beginning to look more and more like Stanley as a victim rebelling against the narrator. But no matter what, he can't escape. Oh, how they wish to destroy each other. Oh, how they need each other. This feels like a good time to mention that the figurine ending causes the narrator to realize that he doesn't need Stanley anymore, claiming that Stanley was always a piece of fiction that he invented to make decisions for him. Look, the Watsonian perspective says that this is probably untrue and is in fact a delusion for the sake of absolving him of the horrible things he said and done to Stanley, since at no other point in this game is it implied for Stanley to have been invented by the narrator, at least not that I'm aware of. And we know the narrator is unreliable, so I'm not putting much weight into it. The Doylist perspective says that this is the developer's way of saying that they're done with the Stanley parable, and considering you need this ending to unlock the epilogue that effectively implies the same thing, I'd say that that's more accurate. Either way, not super useful for our purposes, but I figured I'd mention it in case anyone was curious. All in all, though, the bucket demonstrates even more of how Stanley and the narrator's relationship involves a disturbing amount of coercive control. But it still seems like the narrator truly believes he's doing the right thing, as if he's filling the role of a benevolent authoritarian rather than a cruel tyrant. This whole dynamic, this whole game reminds me of something rather odd. So let me ask you, dear viewer, have you ever heard of Bartleby the Scrivener? Back in 1853, Herman Melville wrote a short story titled Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street. The story is told from the perspective of Bartleby's boss who can't seem to understand Bartleby at all. Now for those unaware, a scrivener is someone who writes or copies documents by hand. Bartleby's entire job was tediously copying legal documents by writing them down. A boring, tedious job, huh? Well, to make a short story shorter, Bartleby eventually starts refusing to work, saying, "I would prefer not to." He eventually begins to do nothing. Nothing at all. Just staring out the window, even refusing to leave the office he originally was employed at. Bartleby goes on to reject all of the narrator's offers for help, and is eventually imprisoned in a detention facility and then dies of starvation since he preferred not to eat. Now, you might be wondering, why is this relevant to anything we're talking about? Well, a few reasons. First, the narrator in the Stanley parable and Bartleby the Scrivener are very similar. They both can't understand that main character, but desperately want to help them, but can only do so in the ways they know how. See, Bartleby the Scrivener is a pretty famous story and has been interpreted in 100 different ways. Some of those interpretations include that it's about free will, the rejection of capitalism by showing how soul-crushing certain work can be, and that the narrator is a benevolent authoritarian who wants to help Bartleby, but can only do so by telling him what he thinks is best for Bartleby. I'm not saying any of these are right or wrong, I'm just describing common interpretations that others have made. But you can see how Bartleby and Stanley are parallels, though, and how the narrators of each story reflect one another: a soul-crushing and boring job, rejection of authority, and inability to understand someone who rebels. The thematic overlap between the two works are numerous. But the reason I mentioned this story is because one of my favorite interpretations of Bartleby, and one that's more common than you may think, is that many have argued that he was written like he has autism. Now, there's many reasons for it, like how he only eats one type of food, ginger nuts, how he seems to struggle with typical social situations and withdrawals from society, how he seems to enjoy repetition, how he avoids eye contact. And while researching this, I've also found that some have argued that the author himself may have been on the spectrum. There's no way for us to know for sure, though, as that sort of thing wasn't even conceived of as a diagnosis yet at the time of Herman Melville's life. So with that being said, is it possible to interpret Stanley as having autism, or at the very least being autistic coded? I'd honestly say yes, and I say this not just as someone with a psychology background, but as someone married to a person with autism. Stanley enjoys the same type of repetition that Bartleby does, and pushing buttons is a common way for people with autism to stim. The bucket could also be seen as a comfort item, since it's literally made to bring comfort to Stanley. In multiple endings, he's shown to have consistent routines, and he's resistant to the narrator's authority. We're not able to see Stanley interact with anyone else, so it's hard to say how he behaves in those contexts, but he certainly doesn't seem very upset over everyone going missing. In fact, he's more confused than anything else. Not to mention, but I highly suspect Stanley wasn't intended to be autism coded, much like Bartleby, which just adds another layer of coincidence. You could also probably argue that the narrator shares several of these traits, but I feel like it's slightly less strong of an argument in his scenario. My reason being is that people with autism are much more likely to be victims than the perpetrators, and usually the perpetrators in these situations are people like the narrator. They want control. They want to take advantage of their victim, believing they know what's right for them. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that people with autism can't be perpetrators, just that it's less common for them to be and more common for them to be the victims. But exceptions exist. This is just based on statistics. I'll be honest with you, this is a pretty horrible situation, only made worse by the fact that while I understand where the narrator is coming from, that doesn't excuse his behaviors. But that's the thing about these types of relationships. A lot of the times, the perpetrator will in fact care about the victim, but they're unable to understand how they're hurting them. Two people constantly hurting each other, blurring the line between victim and abuser. Usually in these situations, though, one still has more power over the other, and we discussed earlier how the female narrator said that Stanley and the narrator need each other. So, with all of this in mind, is that true? Well, strictly speaking, neither one of them has much of a choice. But that makes this a tragedy, since it's impossible for them to both be happy at the same time. While the narrator at least certainly needs Stanley, whether or not Stanley needs him is a bit harder to figure out. This really hinges on whether or not Stanley cares about the narrator, but we don't ever get to know Stanley's true feelings from himself. At best, we can extrapolate from the various endings, and I feel like based on those we've seen in this video, Stanley doesn't care for the narrator at all. Their relationship is effectively one of codependency. The narrator needs Stanley to play his story, feed his ego, and reassure him. Whenever Stanley refuses to give him what he wants, though, he lashes out until Stanley is forced to try again. Stanley has given everything that he can to the narrator, and yet he keeps on taking. So what the female narrator said is mostly true. Stanley needs the narrator in the sense that he's stuck with him, but the narrator needs Stanley in two ways. He both cares for him and is stuck with him. But that's the thing though, isn't it? If you cared for someone, wouldn't you want them to be happy? Wouldn't you want to find a compromise? Because let's admit it, while the narrator at least tries in a few endings to find a compromise, someone always ruins it. I'm not talking about Stanley though. That's because I haven't been fully honest with you. There's one more character we need to consider, the one who's most at fault for nearly everything that's occurred. You. The player has never been just a passive observer, but rather an active participant during this entire dynamic. I told you at the beginning of the video, one of the ways to view Stanley is that he's not separate from the player at all. So, what, was the entirety of this video just a waste of time? Well, no, because I propose that Stanley is both separate and the same as the player, simultaneously. Stanley has no choice but to go with whatever choices we make while we're in control, but he's free to do what he wants when we're not. And if you know anything about Deltarune, then just imagine that, for instance. But that means that our idea of this dynamic has changed. Now the player is at the top, the narrator is subject to your whims, and Stanley is caught up in between the both of you. You, the player, have the ability to know everything that is happening in the game. You're free to get whatever ending you want, to get whatever laughs or cries you want. I don't think the entire video was a waste of time, but I do think we need to sit with the uncomfortable reality that maybe the narrator and Stanley are just different faces in a mirror we're holding up to ourselves. You are the reason, you are the constant, you're the one who chooses to start the game again. You're the one who selects which pain they'll experience next. You're the one who makes them walk into the mind control facility, into the Zen garden, into the museum, into the same story over and over and over again. You are the one perpetuating the cycle. Because remember, this is a satirical game, and you can't have a game without a player. It's always been about you, the choices you make, and how those choices don't matter. You can't save them, so instead you keep going, putting them through this cycle on repeat until you've had your fun. You're torturing them for your enjoyment. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt here. It's not because you hate them. It's because you're curious or bored. But you already know what happens next. You've done this, we've all done this, because you're not really here to make a choice. You're here to be told that you could have. You're given a simulation of choice, and instead of rejecting it, you crave it. Because maybe it'll finally give you the ending you want. Maybe this time it'll make sense. Maybe this time Stanley will be happy. Maybe you'll feel something. But none of that ever happens. None of that will ever happen. Let's say you don't want to be doing this. Let's say you really, truly want to see an ending where they're both happy, but because it doesn't exist, you're left with nothing but unfulfilled dreams. What's left for you to do? How can you win? You were already told how. She said it herself. Quit. That's the only way to beat this game.
As long as you move forward, you'll be walking someone else's path. Stop now and it'll be your only true choice. Whatever you do, choose it. Don't let time choose for you. Don't let...
That's the only real win in the Stanley parable. Stop playing, walk away, and let them go. That would be the kindest thing you can do for them. Because what kind of freedom is it if it only exists when someone else allows it? Stanley is trapped, the narrator is trapped, and the more you play, the more they suffer. Again, and again, and again. The end is never the end. For your curiosity and amusement and closure, they can't be happy, they can't be free, unless you let them. That's a strange thought, isn't it? That compassion could look like silence, that the most humane thing a player could do is not play the game. But the Stanley Parable has always been about that paradox. How do you find freedom in a system built to be limiting? Stanley's not free. He never was, never will be. He's trapped in someone else's voice, someone else's expectations. Even when he rebels, it's just a different script that is being followed. On the same coin, though, the narrator isn't free either. He needs you, your attention, needs someone to notice he exists. The only way to win, for them to be happy, is for you to give up control and to stop being the player. And we're so used to chasing control that even when it means someone else has to break under it, we will still pursue it. But the thing is, this is just a game. You're not the narrator. You're not Stanley. You're not stuck. And it's not too late to do things differently. Out there, in your own story, there is no script you have to follow. You don't have to keep cycling the same ending over and over again. You can stop, you can quit, you can choose something else. It's not always easy, but it's not too late. Just whatever you do, don't let time choose for you. You know, if I had the time, I would have gone through every ending in this video, but alas, sacrifices must be made for the sake of actually producing the video. Huge thanks to my channel members, well, singular member, for supporting the channel. If this connected with you and you want to support deeper dives like this, consider becoming a member. It directly helps me make more of these long-form essays, and it means a lot to me. And if you're not ready for that, then no problem. Liking, commenting, or subscribing helps more than you could possibly know. Thank you for watching, and try to take care of yourself. And if you didn't like this ending, then, well, you could always restart the video. Who knows? Maybe it'll end differently this time.